M. The Media Project. Imagine a vibrant region that embraces innovative technology and systems, allowing individuals and businesses to grow and thrive within the natural and cultural lifestyle of Vermont. Imagine the Black River Innovation Campus. Our community includes business and technology programming, co-working and technology tools, and other exciting experiences that are quickly creating an outsized impact to our little corner of northern New England here in Springfield, Vermont. PC Mag rates Springfield, Vermont number 8 for the best work-from-home cities in the U.S. Join us in Vermont. Begin your journey at bricvt.org.
Howdy, all you rural tech folks out there listening. This is another Innova802 podcast. I am your co-host for the Innova802 Crew, Scott M. Graves, down here in central Vermont on the west side of the mountains. You see, here in Vermont, it matters. You're either west side, east side. You know, it's like the West Coast, East Coast type thing from like the 90s. And here I am on the west side. With me in the virtual studio are my two co-hosts, members of the Innova802 Crew. I've got Ryan Munn over in White River Junction.
Hello, here in White River.
And up in B-Town, Burlington, the Queen City, Burlington, Vermont, we have Will Jeffries.
Calling in from the Vermont Center for Emerging Technologies, one of our favorite places to be, favorite recording spots. And also the other thing you forgot, Scott, is we get to share weather being on the west side together.
This is true. This is true. We do share a lot of weather, and I'm excited for today's guest because those of you who are longtime listeners in general to many of the podcasts at the Media Project will remember our guest. Kevin Chu is the executive director of the Vermont Futures Project, and he was on about a year ago, and for the Are We Here Yet podcast, where we focused on mostly the housing component to the work that Vermont Futures Project is doing, to the message that the Vermont Futures Project is sending both internally to Vermonters and externally. And today we're going to broaden that a bit and talk more on the workforce development and tech side of that. But I'm sure housing will be in there too, because frankly, the ecosystem is the ecosystem and all this stuff is related.
Yeah, and it's been a pretty exciting year for the Vermont Futures Project with quite a bit of very prolific work coming out early in the year with the Economic Action Plan for Vermont, as well as an op-ed, Vermont's Future is a Choice Between Scarcity and Abundance, which I find both very fascinating reads. So thank you, first of all, for the work you've done and been doing for many years, Kevin, and really appreciate having you on the show with us today. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate you making the time to have this conversation. Hello to the listeners. Really appreciate you all being part of the conversation about how to build a brighter future here in Vermont.
Awesome. So I want to start off just with kind of a leader question of just a little bit of your background, kind of coming to Vermont Futures and how that started, and maybe a little comment on how you find time to do all this great research.
Thanks, Ryan. So my story, I'm going to start back with the personal story. I am the son of immigrant parents. My parents immigrated to Vermont, of all places, from Southeast China back in 1986. They had one social connection to the United States. I have an aunt that married an American, and they happen to live here in this wonderful state. Neither of my parents spoke English when they arrived. Neither of them had a college degree, and they took a really brave leap of faith to leave behind everything they knew and come to the state in pursuit of economic opportunity, the American dream. And I share that story because it very much shapes my perspective and how I carry out the work of the Futures Project. To me, it's about opportunity. How do we continue to make sure that opportunity is part of the Vermont narrative, not only today, but moving forward into the future as well.
That's incredible. I think I've heard that briefly before, but never quite as much detail about only knowing one person and coming here on such a leap of faith. Apologize for maybe dating you, but how long ago was that? You said 70s?
They moved to Vermont in 1986, and I was born
1986.
a few years after that.
Yep. Excellent. Wow, that's amazing. So that really kind of, I can see how that informed and influenced the work that you're doing today. Did you go to school here in college in Vermont, or did you leave and come back like some folks?
I stayed here. I like to say I grew up in Vermont. I want to grow old here too. I'm a graduate of Burlington High School, pre-Macy's. They'll be moving out of that space soon. And then I attended Middlebury College, where I studied environmental studies and education. And I like to joke, I also majored in track and field, spent just as much time on that as my studies. And then I stayed here to begin my professional career, worked at the University of Vermont for about 6 years in a variety of capacities before joining the Futures Project.
Awesome. Okay. So how long now has the Vermont Futures Project been going? And it didn't start with you, right? It was going before you joined the project?
It did not start with me. The Futures Project was launched in about 2015 from the Vermont Chamber of Commerce, who work in the policy space, and they advocate on behalf of the business community to create conditions for economic vitality here in the state. And the Futures Project was created to bring a consistent data and research perspective to inform the policy conversations. So early on, the work was aggregating data from federal sources, from state sources, sometimes even local sources when that data was available or reliable. And then that set up the organization to shift more towards the education part of the mission. During the pandemic, my predecessor, Lori Smith, launched the Vermont Economy Talks. It was an educational campaign to help demystify what we mean when we say the economy. Sometimes it feels like this nebulous thing that just happens to us. But in reality, we are all active participants in the economy, especially at the local level. So the decisions that we make, the choices, both at an individual and a collective level, shape what that economy is.
Absolutely. So it sounds like a bit of divergence from traditional economics theory into behavioral economics and real observing what's happening on the ground.
Certainly. The sweet spot for the Futures Project is this convergence of numbers and narrative. It's qualitative and quantitative. And when we're working towards a future that's 10, 15 years away, certainly the helpful in understanding trends where if current conditions hold, but data isn't destiny. If we don't like the direction of the trend lines, we can influence the outcomes. And that's why we need the human element to guide where that future should go. The work of the Futures Project to build an economic action plan was anchored in the hopes, dreams, and ambitions of Vermonters.
And Kevin, I know that part of what's been really interesting and compelling to me about the work that you're doing is not just the data that you're gathering, but the way that you've been really working to make this accessible and to really tell a story around Vermont, not just to policymakers, but to individual Vermonters in towns and municipalities across the state. And that just strikes me as really important to be able to break down this big, sometimes abstract idea. Since I don't know if all of our listeners will have necessarily read the plan just yet, although I hope that after this episode they do, would you be able to give us a quick breakdown of some of what you feel like are the most important parts of that story that you've been able to tell through this data that's been gathered over the years?
Certainly. So I have the privilege of speaking with over 5,000 Vermonters over the past 2 years. And it wasn't just to speak about where we are in terms of the data, but as I mentioned, it's to understand what are the hopes, dreams, and ambitions, but also what are the challenges that are preventing us from getting to where we want to go. And I heard time and again, housing is one of those challenges, the cost of living, workforce shortages, healthcare, childcare, the business climate. These were all topics that came up time and again in every community. And as I listened to Vermonters, they also described some of the things that make this state so special and unique. And I took the opportunity to describe the sentiments in 3 broad buckets. This is where the Futures Project was able to create a framework to shape the data. One of the sentiments that I heard was, I want ample services. Things like access to healthcare, things like schools in local communities, access to transportation. These are things that really enable people to interact with their neighbors, to participate in the economy, and to thrive in their communities. Another sentiment that I heard was, I want low density. I like Vermont as this place with low population and the growth of New York or New Jersey. And then the third bucket I heard was, I want lower cost of living. It's not viable for me to thrive here economically. So when we take these 3 circles and create a Venn diagram, the intersection of all 3 doesn't exist. And this is where we have to have some difficult conversations, right? Right now, we're at the intersection of ample services and low density, and the result is high cost of living. Back to what I heard from Vermonters time and again, folks are saying the cost of living's too high. I can't afford to live here. So how do we get there from here, right? And how do we know? Are we there yet? Price is sort of an indicator in that regard. So to get from where we are to a desired future state that is a little bit more affordable, we can either take a scarcity pathway, and that's reduction in services, cutting programs, or we can choose an abundance pathway. Ryan, you mentioned my op-ed. The abundance pathway is embracing the idea that people are the solution and housing helps us get there. Embracing the idea that more density can be beneficial for people who are already here as well.
Absolutely. I'm just going to mention too, for anybody that wants to follow along, vtfuturesproject.org, pop in there, check out that op-ed, check out the action plan, and a lot of visuals really help comprehend these challenges and put them into perspective. So appreciate that for sure, Kevin. Thank you.
And so the crux of what you're talking about, Kevin, first by population, right, is we need to repopulate the state of Vermont, right? Talk about the specifics. Why is that so? And what will happen with the number of new people here that we want to bring to Vermont?
Certainly. If we've been holding our listeners in suspense, one of the goals of the Economic Action Plan is this ambitious target to grow Vermont's population to 802,000. We're currently at about 648,000. And that growth is, again, to repopulate the working age population. Vermont's overall population has gone up a little bit over the past 25 years, but it's also aged at the same time. So in the year 2000, we had about 226,000 Vermonters between the ages of 25 to 49. That's our workforce. That's our tax base. Those are the commercial ratepayers in health insurance. So 226,000. In that same year, we had about 77,000 Vermonters age 65 plus. Now, fast forward to today, and we have about 194,000 Vermonters between 25 to 49. So that's over 30,000 fewer than 25 years ago. And we have about 143,000 who are 65 plus, almost double, right? So our workforce is shrinking. That's why so many businesses are having trouble hiring. Our tax base is shrinking. So we're asking a smaller pool of people to shoulder a greater burden to cover the cost of services and programs. At the same time, the need for those services and programs is also increasing because as a population ages, healthcare needs go up, housing needs go up. The needs of the population now are drastically different than they were just 25 years ago.
And I want our listeners, I want to I want them to be able to identify, right, what this means, right, when we are talking amongst ourselves, both for those of us here in Vermont most importantly. And these are the same, very similar conversations happening in other rural parts of the United States right now, right? Including some of our neighboring states. And that is like in the recent March elections here in Vermont, in our local paper, a woman was interviewed who stated, plainly she was not voting for our current mayor, Mike Donges, because, and I roughly paraphrase, we are increasing our taxes to an unsustainable point on the elderly, who increasingly are more and more of our population. And here in Rutland, they cannot afford those increases in taxes anymore. So to me, the solution is, reduce our costs on police, fire, EMT, reduce the school budget, and restrict the number of young families who have children in our schools. So why is that argument on its face? Doing so will reduce costs, right? To restrict or as you say, create a modicum of scarcity, right? But why will that create the disclaimer? It's going to create the opposite effect on taxes, right? But explain for our listeners why that's so.
Certainly. So we have to take a look at both the short-term and long-term impacts of these decisions. Short-term, it might reduce some of those budget deficits. It might close that gap. It might mean that things are more affordable the next year or two as services are cut or programs are reduced in terms of scope and capacity. But that makes it even harder to attract the next generation. It makes it even harder to convince a young family that they should move here, put their kids in the schools in Vermont, and it makes it even harder for our businesses who are homegrown here in Vermont to scale up. It makes it harder to attract new businesses to Vermont.
Less people to buy their stuff, right? Yeah.
Less people to buy their stuff, fewer employees, fewer collisions of ideas to spark innovation, right? If we continue to cut, makes the community a shaky foundation to build an aspirational vision. I think that whether you're a citizen or a business, having a sense of safety in your community is important. Knowing that the kids are going to have opportunities in school beyond just the curriculum. Extracurriculars are something that add vitality and richness to an educational experience. Having hospital services that are nearby rather than in an adjacent county or even across state lines, those are really important. So in the short term, yes, there are efficiency strategies. We can try to do more with what we have. I'm certainly not saying that we are at 100% efficiency, but even if we were, we would still need some expansion. And again, this is where the data is so powerful, because I had this conversation in terms of workforce. People say, well, why don't we just try to retain more of the kids that we have in our high schools or the college graduates? And the numbers tell us, yes, even if we kept all of our graduates, we would still have a workforce gap because there are more people retiring per year than people graduating. The Vermont Department of Labor projects 17,150 retirements per year. Do you know how many 12th graders there are in the entire state of Vermont? About 5,300. Those numbers don't balance out. We don't retain 100% of those 12th graders either. So we need both.
And plus, I mean, if I'm a municipality of some kind, right, I have two ways to generate tax revenue, property tax revenue, which fuels all of this, okay? Services, that is. Organic revenue growth, which is new properties or properties that are not generating property taxes right now come back online, i.e. abandoned or underutilized properties are optimized. And that's new households, new organic growth. Or my aging population continues to shrink at the same time it's aging. And so in plain English, I'm putting the screws to the same households, except those households are they're shrinking down while at the same time they're also aging and more of them are older. So that's where you get into a downward spiral. And this is what rural communities of many different shapes and sizes throughout the United States are experiencing. as they take the attitude of, we're going to start to shrink that. We just can't spend this kind of money anymore. We need to shrink things down, instead of saying, what do we have to do to retain young working class people who are able to pay taxes because they're not on a fixed income?
Retain or attract them from elsewhere. There's a lot around that people want to enjoy and experience. It's why we have such a robust visitor economy. And there are plenty of folks who visit Vermont regularly who might actually want to relocate here, but we have to be okay with the idea of growth and proactively build the capacity to allow that to happen.
Driven by data. Driven by technology. Driven by community development. Driven by the need to get results for your project. SM Graves Associates. Delivering real estate development to you, including project management and pre-development services, with a keen focus on delivering community-oriented projects. We build profitable projects that respond to the needs of your neighborhood. Join the SMG family. Find us at smgravesassociates.com.
In your opinion, both inside and outside of tech or tech-enabled sectors, where are Vermont's, based on any number of factors that you see from your perspective, what are the sectors that we have the highest sort of aptitude towards attracting a critical mass of?
Certainly, I think tech does play a big role, and tech itself permeates into so many different industries, right? And I think that's something that's often lost in conversation, as it's siloed off, but in reality, how we apply technologies to existing industries is such an opportunity where I hope Vermont will lead. And I think we're already seeing that in the ways that it's embedded into some of the manufacturing processes, advanced manufacturing. We have companies emerging like Beta and OnLogic who are at the forefront of their sectors. And then we have some of the more traditional Vermont industries or sectors, such as agriculture, such as tourism, that we can't forget about. Those will continue to play an important part of the Vermont fabric. But if we add new industries, it doesn't take away from the old. I think that's one of the pieces that I want listeners to take away, which is it's not an either or. It's not us versus them. The growth isn't a threat to what currently exists. It can actually amplify the benefits of what currently exists. I also think there's an opportunity for Vermont to be a leader in terms of healthcare, especially in responding to the needs of elderly populations, right? Because Vermont is one of the oldest states by median age, the impacts of an aging demographic are ones that our state will experience before many others. So the solutions that we develop can then be exported or scaled to serve the needs of an aging nation.
And the reality is there are easier places to live as you get older. So I like to think that our aging population also has a good amount of experiential and intellectual value to add to this overall conversation when we talk about, retiring executives, retiring tech people that still want to give back to their community, whether it's the Vermont community or their global community of innovators. And so I think there's a huge opportunity that we're seeing play out in very small pieces in the tech hubs, the incubator programs, the co-work spaces around the state. Can you elaborate a little bit more on partially what we need to do to attract those families and attract those young people to stick around, and also what you're seeing happening that's working?
Certainly, I think you raised such a great point, which is as people age, I think it's easy for us to just look at the data in terms of workforce, taxpayers, and frame an aging population as a negative, but there are so many positives that come with having an experienced population that's ready to mentor the next generation. In the economic plan, we even highlight the contributions that a mature workforce can bring to the state economy. And in terms of one of the challenges that many families face right now, young families with kids, is childcare, and having an older population who might be taking a step back from the workforce, they can help to fill some of those gaps in terms of family needs. Just thinking about my own family and the sort of Chinese culture in which I was raised, multi-generational households was a very regular thing. And I think, again, Vermont is situated well to show a different way of growing families. And if we can take the lead there, then I think it'll start to permeate into how we approach economic problems and solutions as well, bringing together multiple generations into the workforce. You get a diversity of perspectives that then allow us to leverage existing or emerging technologies to meet different needs across generations.
I really love how you put that, Kevin. And it's funny you say that, because that's actually conversations that have been happening within my own family as well. And I really appreciate your question of, is there a new way that we could be looking at this? Or rather, perhaps there are solutions, old ways of thinking that could be brought back that might be relevant for our times, that might actually help contribute to these thriving communities. And I love finding those opportunities where 1 + 1 is really 3. Are there other opportunities for that type of collaboration, or maybe missed opportunities for resources or ways that we already have available in this state to utilize? What are some actions that we can start taking, just like you were describing, in terms of the way multiple families, or multiple generations, I should say?
Certainly. I think 1 + 1 can equal 3 when we look at the intersection of demographics and housing. So median household size has been going down as our population ages. It's a predictable trend, right? Let's say you have a family of 4, and 20 years ago, it was 2 adults, 2 kids, family purchased a 4-bedroom house. Today, those kids have grown up and they've moved out, and there are 2 older adults occupying a 4-bedroom home. They have extra space that they're underutilizing. How do we tap into that? We need new housing that meets their current needs, because there are a lot of Vermonters that might want to downsize, but that means we need new housing stock for them to move into. And as they do, it opens up what they're currently occupying for a young growing family. And without that expansion, we don't have healthy mobility, so that people are kind of stuck in place, right? Aging in place by choice, that's one thing. Aging in place because you're stuck, that kind of sucks. And everyone I talk to says, I want my kids to at least think of Vermont as a possibility. To do that, we, again, need more housing, because as those kids have aged, if they want to move out, if we haven't built anything in the community, their 2 choices are stay at home with mom and dad or move out of state. So new housing serves the families who are already here.
On the subject of housing, you and I have talked about this many times. And of course, yours truly has had another year of living and experiencing what it means to try to build and to advocate for housing, middle market housing here in the state of Vermont. And I recently came to the realization that part of our challenge is that at least half of our neighbors, I love them, right or wrong, but at least half of our neighbors seem to think that the housing crisis is not a crisis. No one will dispute that there's shortages of certain types of housing. But I keep coming across people, some of which have even told me just flat out, it's not a crisis. It's what keeps flatlanders like you from moving here. What do we do? I mean, I guess essentially this is the reason for the existence of the Vermont Futures Project, right? To get as many of our Vermont neighbors on the same page as far as what is this narrative we're trying to tell? How do we build a resilient and sustainable future Vermont? We've got, what are your thoughts on this idea that we got to get this portion of the population off of the idea that that a lack of housing can at all be a good thing?
I think we can start with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? What are those basic physiological needs that every human has? Water, food, air, shelter, right? And I hear all the time, housing is a human right. So if housing is a human right, it should be right to build housing. Yet we encounter folks in our own communities who show up and try to fight against new housing, even though we like to state that it's a human right. So I think there's a bit of disconnect there. I actually am encouraged by some of the data that I've seen. So you mentioned maybe about half of our neighbors, Scott. I've actually got more precise numbers to bring to this conversation. The question that I put in the Vermonter poll was, are you supportive of creating new housing to increase the population in Vermont, in your town, in your neighborhood? I asked at 3 different scales. At the Vermont scale, 60% of respondents said yes. Your town, 57% said yes. Your neighborhood, 46.3% said yes. So that's where we see a dip from over 50% to under. But the story that I think we need to take away is actually at every single scale, Vermont, your town, your neighborhood, there are more respondents that say yes than no. But we hear the no voices very loudly. And I think we need to do more to empower the yes voices. I had a conversation with someone on the development review board in Williston. Williston, Vermont has a lot of retail stores, and they have workers that are traveling daily from adjacent towns and sometimes even outside of Chittenden County to get to work. So Williston thought, well, maybe we should build more housing here. Some of those employees really want to live closer to where they work. It would actually be good for them. It'd be good for the environment, fewer vehicle miles traveled. So proposals were put forth by developers to create more housing. And yes, some has gone up, but there is consistently a cohort of folks who live in Williston who show up and oppose it and say no. And they don't even need a large cohort, 10, 12 people. That's enough to slow things down or stop any progress. Meanwhile, hundreds of retail workers who would benefit most from the housing have no say in the process. Their voice doesn't count because they're not Williston residents. So how can we start to intentionally include the yes voices? Because the data tell us there are actually more of them, and we need to listen to them too.
I'm gonna encourage you. So let's talk about some tools, right, or some pathways that might get us closer to a more equitable conversation about the housing that leads to better outcomes. The revisions of Act 250, good, bad. What's your opinions on that?
Stepped in the right direction, not the scale that'll solve the crisis. There's no single solution. I think we have to take a look at the full suite of factors that impact housing, whether it is land use regulations, zoning, permitting, appeals processes. It's going to be a multifaceted strategy, and I'm encouraged by some of the momentum of recent changes, but I don't think it goes far enough.
CHIPS TIF program. This is the small scale TIF option that legislation that's being discussed now. Good, bad, indifferent.
Good. I think another tool to add to our toolkit that allows different scale of projects to be viable. To me, it's not about having a top-down cookie-cutter template that every single town has to follow. One of the things I try to do through the Work of the Futures project is to highlight data, highlight recommendations, strategies, and tactics that become options for people and for communities to choose from. But at the end of the day, the housing strategies in Chittenden County are going to be very different than they are in Rutland County or the Northeast Kingdom. And that's okay. That's actually a really good thing. We should have regional variability. It gives more choice to people who might be interested in Vermont to be able to select from different options that fit various needs. And then that allows communities to lean into the unique strengths and assets that they have, which set them apart.
We have the housing we need, right? It just needs to be accessible. Rutland County, some 180 some odd homeless households that permanently reside here. We have 2,413 domiciles currently abandoned in Rutland County.
You bring up such a good point, Scott. So this actually goes back to the question that Will had asked about how to make 1 + 1 = 3. And I did a study to calculate what I call latent capacity on a town-by-town basis. So it's a calculation that looks at current population compared to historical peak. So for some towns, that means that if they've depopulated, let's say they're about 2,000 people now, but they used to be 3,000, there's some untapped potential. There's latent capacity. There may be vacant buildings. Some of that might be empty bedrooms and homes that are occupied by a few people. And that is a way that we can leverage data to guide our search for where investment will create the biggest impact. Where can we unlock that potential? And if we can bring mobility back to the market, we can start tapping into some of those vacant, underutilized homes or refurbish them to make them viable for habitation again. Follow the data.
Indeed.
Something I was really curious to ask as well after a few weeks ago, as part of the Leadership Champlain program, we visited a wastewater treatment plant that services, I believe it was Williston and Essex. I could be wrong about that, but a wastewater treatment plant in that area. And one of the things that I was learning there that was a new piece of information for me about our housing crisis and development was simply how much of a limiting factor our own wastewater processing infrastructure is. And that can be a very expensive piece of infrastructure to invest in. So I love these solutions that you're talking about how can we use existing homes? How can we use rooms that are not being fully utilized? But I am curious as well on that side of building new developments, since those are going to require additional wastewater capacity. Certainly there are ways to make ourselves more efficient, to use what we already have. But I was also wondering, are there areas where you noted, I don't know if this is something you had studied, but areas that had latent infrastructure available for development?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's why I say that to tackle this ambitious vision, we need both efficiency and expansion strategies. There are places that are at capacity, whether it means that towns are at their historical peak population or that they're leveraging most or all of the wastewater and water infrastructure that they currently have. In those locations, there will have to be expansion of some of those fundamental pieces in order to facilitate new growth. In other towns, other places, some of that capacity might already be there because it was built out 50, 100 years ago. And again, that's why the economic action plan isn't a top-down, you shall do type of strategy. It paints the picture with data and highlights the options available to empower communities to dictate where they want to go in the future. With that said, it also paints the picture of how every community can contribute to a collective goal. Because to bring it back to something that was said at the very beginning, it's an ecosystem. And when one town flourishes, adjacent municipalities also benefit. And we have to be able to think regionally. We have to be able to bring that ecosystem approach into our patterns of development, our patterns of growth, so that we can amplify the impact of growth in one place to start benefiting Vermont overall.
I love that idea. And that need for collaboration too, where we have these disparate resources or ways that we can slot these together or collaborate between towns, communities, organizations. That's the theme that I've been seeing cropping up across a lot of industries lately, I really started diving deep into that middle of last year, I would say, and it's continued to grow in terms of the need. But something else I was curious about, you mentioned, because it's in the name, an action plan, and all these recommendations are helpful to guide, to provide the context for how to make those decisions. But I was also curious, would you be able to give us on a couple of different levels where this can really start having concrete actions, concrete choices that perhaps municipalities, state level, individual towns, or even maybe individuals within a certain community might be able to start taking actionable steps on this?
Certainly. So in the action plan, the last section highlights how you can help. And it's from a few different perspectives. So one perspective is as a resident, supporting local growth, choosing as a consumer where you spend your dollars so that we're lifting up local businesses and services, and then advocating for growth-oriented policies. The policymakers in our state, right, are elected by the citizens. So the citizens have a say in where we decide to go for our future. Then another perspective is as a visitor, right, because that's an important cohort to bring into the conversation. Visitors can really help to promote Vermont's strengths and tell their story about why visiting Vermont is so awesome so that more people come and enjoy the state. And as they build that affinity for Vermont, some of them may convert to residents as well. So the visitor perspective is a very important one. And it's great to bring new ideas into the state. So the exchange, the movement of people to different places, whether they're born here, going elsewhere, or they grew up elsewhere and they're coming here, that's healthy for our society. Another perspective is as an employer. So what can you do as an employer? Invest in workforce development and help to create inclusive workforce environments, because we do have people who are on the sidelines who may want to contribute, who may want to participate in the labor force. One of the things the plan does is to highlight the potential that we already have here, and how to reduce or deconstruct barriers that are in the way, whether that's things like childcare or people that are leaving the justice system, folks with disabilities, and there are benefits cliffs that disincentivize work. These are all solvable, and employers can play an important role in being champions for a more inclusive labor force. Policymakers is another perspective that's called out in the call to action, and there are recommendations for how they can leverage data to help guide some of the policy decisions that are being made. Our educational partners are one of the other perspectives that we bring into this to start or continue to align curriculum with evolving labor force opportunities. And that's where we have to facilitate collaboration so that employers, students, educational partners are all co-creating what that educational experience looks like to set up our next generation, not only for the opportunities that exist today, but for the ones that will exist in 10, 15, 20 years.
And if you can comment on that a little deeper on the education piece too, because, you know, Vermont has some interesting statistics around some of the lowest student to teacher ratios, which sounds like a great thing, but at the end of the day, that's also why the talk of consolidating schools is a hot topic. And I have some opinions about this. I think that, more kids in school, in a particular school, the better, the more diversity going on there. Also with technology today, I think there's more opportunity for schools to collaborate across subjects and across curriculum, across different regions. And so, if you would talk a little bit about what you've seen in the data around the benefits and challenges to our academic age population, and how that parlays into this statistic you mentioned before about only 5,000 graduates. I mean, those things are tied to the parent age people of 25 to 49, right? These are all interconnected components.
Certainly are. I'll start off with the macro level numbers in terms of education, which is we have about 20,000 fewer students in our public school system today than we did 20 years ago. So we went from about 100,000 down to about 80,000. And that number is going to continue going down unless we can attract new working age families and grow the population. So that comes with it some challenges. Ryan, you mentioned school consolidation as one of the hot topics right now. The teacher-student ratio, another way to look at that is per pupil spending, right? And as the enrollment numbers go down, there are still some fixed costs. It costs the same amount to keep the lights on in a room when there are 3 people in it versus 30 people in it. And we don't really have economies of scale here in Vermont. So I love that you are bringing the technology perspective into this to open access to new opportunities that might not be available in person for a child in one town. Perhaps they can join a cohort digitally to access educational opportunities in a way that leverages economies of scale. I think you also highlighted another crucial piece, which is when you have enough students, it brings in possibilities of different programs, different extracurriculars, right? It takes a lot of kids to have multiple sports teams every season. And those are things that, again, enrich the lives of young people. So, yes, the one-to-one time, the low teacher-to-student ratio can be a positive in one sense, but we also have to take a step back and ask, is it serving the whole student? Is it serving the whole family and the whole community? Or is it actually limiting some other possibility? And I feel like those conversations are often focused on that scarcity mindset, of that scarcity pathway of like, how do we keep this small thing here and try to do it more efficiently, when really we could ask, wait, how do we grow it so more people have access to it and it becomes cheaper for everyone?
It seems to me too, administratively, right? The governor's idea behind consolidating administration, if it is executed properly, is a good thing, because and kind of against what most other states do, which is we need to make cuts in the school program, so let's cut teachers and programming. No one ever cuts the superintendent. No one ever cuts the assistant superintendent and the assistant to the assistant superintendent. It's kind of like, and because in the corporate world, we don't cut the CEO of GM, we cut 7,500 workers. You see, it's like, well, what is this company comprised of? Is it the people making the cars, or is it the people teaching the kids, or is it, the people who are administering and making sure payroll gets paid and all that? Not to say that those aren't important jobs. It's just, you don't need as many people doing that, right?
Yeah, I'll tell you a story that helps to bring this to life. I was speaking with a business owner in the Middlebury area who used to work for Microsoft doing enterprise sales. And she said her favorite state to work with was Hawaii. You might ask why. Well, maybe it's nice to visit Hawaii, but no, it was because Hawaii operates as one school district across all the islands. So there's efficiency in their administrative structure. And as someone from Microsoft who might be working with that one district doing enterprise sales, it means one phone call, one contract. And they were able to offer much lower prices because of that. Now, if you think about how many small school districts there are across the state of Vermont, that same rep would have to make hundreds of phone calls to sell just a few licenses if you got a yes on the end of one of those 100 calls. You can't.
Actually reminds me of an organization I learned about just recently in Vermont, actually, the Green Mountain Higher Education Consortium of Champlain College, Middlebury College, and St. Michael's, that had actually followed that model of forming a consortium so that they could negotiate for better prices from their suppliers. Just like you said, it makes it so much simpler on that side.
So I do see us coming up on the time here. We need to let you get back to life here, Kevin. And I know we could fill up at least another hour with questions and things to talk about, because you've done such great in-depth work, and we really, really appreciate the contributions that you're making to this conversation here in Vermont. So I think I speak for all of us when I say thank you so much, and I hope I'm speaking for our audience as well. And are there any last comment or calls to action? Definitely we'll have the link in there for folks to go check out Vermont Futures Project. Anything else throughout the end of throughout this year that folks can be looking to be part of the conversation, to catch you at an event somewhere, anything like that that's going on?
Yeah, I'll just wrap up with some concluding thoughts by sharing a sports analogy, because that's often how my brain works. I come from an athletics background, and I really think that everyone listening really wants Team Vermont to succeed. Now, our team, we have a lot of juniors and seniors who are going to be graduating from our workforce soon. And we collectively need to recruit the next class of freshmen to join Team Vermont in order to sustain our success over time, right? And whether that talent is homegrown or that talent is coming from elsewhere, at the end of the day, we just want the best players on our team. So go Team Vermont, do your part.
Thank you again. Really appreciate you, your time, your work, and really look forward to another conversation. In fact, I think we should make you a regular somehow, get into a cadence here, because I know there's so much to talk about and there's so much going on too that we continue to add perspective to with your work. So thank you again.
Thank you, guys. Keep up the good work.
SMG's Are We Here Yet podcast is a production of M the Media Project and SM Graves Associates. Learn more at smgravesassociates.com.